Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our roundtable Q&A event on creating supportive, inclusive workplaces. We're going to start by introducing our four panelists. I'm going to get them to introduce themselves, and then we're going to start taking questions for everyone. If I start with Andrew Knight.
Morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Knight. I'm from the Spark Company. We are specialists in human resource development and organizational transformation. What does that mean? We help people to transform their businesses, create a positive workplace culture, and we can also help with that kind of human side of organizational change, things like, mergers and acquisitions, rapid growth, and those thorny HR issues that crop up from time to time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. And Danielle Bridge.
Hi, I'm Danielle Bridge, Chief Executive of ABC Life Support, which is a physical and mental health first aid training social enterprise. And we go all around the country and deliver physical, mental health in line with health and safety requirements of work.
Brilliant, thank you. And Verma.
Hello, everyone. My name's Verma. I'm the Director of Deep Insight. We deliver EDI training and development to a number of companies. We badge ourselves as a disruptor company because what we want to do is change thinking and our approaches to EDI to go beyond compliance, to really make great change in the environment. And we all know that when we've got a motivated workforce, we get high performance.
Brilliant, thank you. And Neil White.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, my name is Neil Wright. I'm the Managing Director of TensCare Limited. We're a medical device business based in Epsom, team of just under 40 staff, and we're employee owned and have been employee owned for the last 6 years, which is to say the shares are all held in a trust for the benefit of the employees. Yeah, pleased to be here.
Brilliant, thank you everyone. If people want to put their hands up to ask any questions, or feel free to write them in the chat and I can direct them to the right person. Just feel free to go ahead. Silence already. Neil, did you want to just start off with just telling us about what you felt the changes were for moving over to being employee owned and how that created how the workplace became more inclusive?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think we went employee owned. We're a business that's 30 years old and we became employee owned 6 years ago. That is to say that the previous owners sold up. Now, the previous owner didn't do it like a lot of owners transitioning into employee ownership out of philanthropic reasons. He just wanted to sell, make a trade sale. It was myself that actually took it into employee ownership, put the shares into a trust for the benefit of the team. But it was a change in culture. He'd been very entrepreneurial. He'd set the business up 30 years ago and had been successful in doing that, but then was recruiting people into the business and micromanaging them. He was the best salesman, the best accountant, best product developer. And when you do that, you sort of limit how big you can grow. Whereas I'd come from a bigger organization where, work got delegated out and people got empowered to do what they were good at and talented to do. So there was a change of direction, if you like, allowing people to be empowered. So it was a diverse team to start off with in terms of its makeup, but it was not being empowered to unleash their talent, if you like. So that was the biggest change. And everyone shares in the risks and the reward of the business as well. I mean, they're not on the hook financially. It's just that they gain a reward from the dividend at the end of the year. It's been very successful. I mean, our business has tripled in the last 6 years and become significantly profitable, which has meant, lifestyle changing style bonuses for the team. I don't know if you want me to say any more about that or.
No, thank you, Neil. It's I think it's creating that inclusive and supportive network.
Yeah, I think that's what it's about, isn't it, really? It's not just about job performance, it's about sort of creating an environment where people feel they're emotionally and physically supported, for their general well-being. And if you've got, happy staff, happy customers, it's all those good old adages, I know it all sounds a bit housewifey, but actually it's wisdom that's based in truth.
Thank you. I've got a question here. We're 100% remote and I'm struggling a little with collecting diversity data from our team. To do it at hiring stage is really hard because it's difficult to keep it truly anonymous. I ran an anonymous survey a while back and only got a little response, so it really doesn't tell us much at all. I was wondering if anyone else had similar issues and had found a good solution. Open that to everyone, I suppose.
Can I chip in there, Hunter?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that I think every organisation, no matter what sector you're in, kind of grapples with. Not only what can I legitimately collect and how do I collect it, but then what am I going to do with it after? And it almost kind of seems informative at one level to collect the information, but then if that doesn't tell you anything insightful, then almost kind of like don't collect it. But if you are collecting it, then what do you do? And I've had some previous experience working with HR systems and how you change those to be more productive, but also to be more inclusive. And smaller organizations can be really nimble in this space because you're not constrained by a multinational system that's used by and requires 7 levels of governance to approve a change or to do something different. You can do something tomorrow if you wanted. So first thing I would do is I would take this back to the application stage. If you're accepting online applications via Indeed, or whether it's a mailbox into your business, which is kind of quite likely, one thing you can do is auto reply to that application with an anonymous survey using Typeform, SurveyMonkey, forms on Google or Word, Microsoft, whatever you use that basically doesn't cost you any money and that you could stand up tomorrow. And you could get some more insight by asking people who apply separate from their application, completely anonymously, to tell you their diversity information, whatever it is that you're collecting, because actually that might give you some information about parts of the community that you intend to reach and that you're making an effort to include, but actually you may not be inspiring them to apply. And that's really important to know before you get to the hiring stage. And then at the hiring stage, during the induction process, whether that be an hour and look around the office or whether you've got something a bit more structured, you can ask people at that stage to, in a private and confidential way, tell you their diversity information once they're already hired. But I'm kind of caveating this approach with assuming that it's kind of a safe space and people feel comfortable and they're not forced to, because this is an optional thing rather than a mandatory thing. And then how you store and process that data, not only from an inclusion and psychologically safe environment perspective, but also from a GDPR perspective, is really important. So I would say collect at the right stage, collect what you legitimately need, and no more than what you legitimately need either. Don't link it to any individual record, and that kind of means that when you say it's anonymous, it really is. But also, if you're going to the trouble of collecting all that information, which is a really positive thing to do, like make sure you do something with that to give you insight and to improve the inclusivity of your business. Otherwise, honestly, you might as well not collect it. It's better to do something with it, because when you collect it, you create the expectation that something's going to happen with that data.
Brilliant, thank you. Is anyone else on?
Yeah, I wanted to also just follow on from Andrew. Also, why you're collecting it, right? What you're going to do with the data is fine, but why are you collecting it? And I know there's a number of small organisations that I've worked with where it's very obvious in terms of the amount of diversity that they have there. And also following on from Andrew, how safe is the environment? What's the culture like? Do people want to disclose any considerations that they might have based upon historic problems or situations that these people may have? They might not want to be open, and that's also quite interesting in this space, is creating an environment for people to want to be open and honest about things. But it's all tends to be, especially at the moment, quite a lot of, well, we are diverse, we're wanting to do this, wanting to do that, wanting to collect data, but where's the actual culture, what does that look like? What does that feel like? Does it go above numbers? What does it look like in terms of conversations that are being had, or how is it that we're treating people? So I guess I'm kind of less data driven, more touchy-feely soft. You know, what are people actually saying? What is it that they want? How are these conversations being had versus collecting data?
Brilliant, thank you. And I think it's it's about making them, especially in a smaller team, making them feel comfortable that they can fill it in, and that is going to be anonymous.
It also touches on employee representation. How do you get your employees in a situation where they do feel able to disclose that? Have you got any examples, Danielle, of how organisations can do that? Obviously, the culture's got to be there, you know, from the beginning. But have you got any good examples of how you can sort of get people to open up in a safe way?
So yeah, so first of all, conversations rather than bits of paper. Bits of paper are fantastic to collect data, but conversations are super important. And I think, for example, in physical first aid, if you live with a pre-existing medical condition, which means, say, for example, you have fits, you live with epilepsy. If you go to work, it's preferable that you tell your employees that you live with epilepsy so that they can create a safe environment and have a care plan for you in place. The same thing applies with mental health as well, although that is a little bit more fragile, should we say, at the moment, in terms of people disclosing because of discrimination that we have within mental health, and we do have that within mental health. So from that point of view, it's about creating conversations and line management responsibility where a dialogue can be had on a more personal level, so that trust is being built up, rather than filling in a piece of paper which then gets pushed to HR and nobody kind of has any dialogue or conversation around that as well. So from my point of view, it's about having an understanding of the people that you work with on an individual basis as much as possible, especially within line management, and having really clear and transparent conversations about what that responsibility looks like from an employee point of view, but also from an employer point of view. Because I've said before, I did a course yesterday and said, you know, if you lived with epilepsy and you went to work and you had a fit, then the organisation have a responsibility to call for an ambulance, make sure that you're treated safely. But that going to hospital in an ambulance is kind of taken out of your hands, whereas most people who live with epilepsy, and they have a normal, what I call a normal seizure, they wouldn't want to go to hospital. They don't need to. They live with this condition. But if you haven't disclosed, then they have no choice but to follow the protocol for that. And the same thing applies with mental health situations. You know, people are often able to manage their own mental health conditions if there is support at work, but they have to go through the understanding that they are supported and there is the correct processes in place for that. So for me, it's about building up an awful lot of trust in these dialogues as opposed to filling out bits of paper.
I think Benjamin is
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, Benjamin's.
Yeah, I think just to echo what Danielle said, and we do, our kind of day-to-day is doing employee surveys, and that section of the survey is always one of the hardest to get good response rates for, and it does really come down to communicating what you're doing with the data, and that makes a really big difference as to people answering, explaining really clearly why you want it and how that's a benefit to everybody in the organization, because people are quite reluctant to that. I think one other thing is also not delineating, but just being aware of what I would call legal definitions versus needs. So, for example, disability comes with some requirements around reasonable adjustments, and some people wouldn't necessarily identify as disabled and may not have that as but may have a learning disability, for example, which is something to understand in your environment. So again, thinking about how you have a broad way for people to express what that is. Oftentimes, a lot of the collecting of that data is trying to put people in buckets with people who don't necessarily want to be in buckets. So I think it's just being aware of getting a combination of the things you need from a statutory point of view, and also understanding your organization and creating an environment where people can express, actually, I find this particular thing hard or easy, or I'd appreciate this kind of support, or I feel excluded because of this kind of thing. So, having a way to do that. I would make just a little note on just data collection, because again, just from a legal point of view, just because you're not asking a name doesn't mean it's not identifiable.
So if you're using something outside of the UK, so, you know, a lot of the US products put kind of marketing trackers and things like that on the free platform. So just be aware that you are actually potentially identifying your employees. And we had somebody recently who came to us, had used that, and their employee had got targeted with some marketing because of how they'd answered the questions, because they'd used the free platform that was doing that. So just be aware where the data is going. You know, a lot of systems will kind of track users, and this is a very explicit privacy platform. So again, just being careful around that. To again, what Daniel said, that culture of trust about we're going to share this information, it's safe, also comes down to the platforms and what you do with it as well.
Brilliant, thank you.
So just to follow up on that, Benjamin, I think that was excellent what you've just said. Having lived through a lifetime of working with a home office and having 16 to 32 categories to try and box people in, it's very hard to get people to trust the system. Secondly, when you are doing data collection, it's been said before, but why are you doing it? And not enough people are putting thought into this, because data collection comes in two ways. One is you want to show the optics of your organizations. Look how diverse we are. We've got some Black people, we've got people from LGBT, we've got somebody on the board that might have a disability, etc. So those are the optics, but what is it that we're really trying to uncover? If we're trying to uncover what are the barriers to well-being, then it's a different set. So with a lot of organizations, there's a lot of ritual data collection that employees get bored with. I got bored with it. I did 30 years in policing, and do you know, I used to be given a strategic staff survey every year, and I said, but that's not what people are saying on the ground. So there's two ways of doing this. So yes, we need empirical data if you're mandated to do that. Even if you want empirical data, organizationally, what are you going to do with it? Are you trying to change the culture? Are you trying to change representation? Are you trying to, so you've got to link it to some organizational objectives.
Brilliant, thank you.
I suppose just while we've got a pause in the session, I'd sort of just follow up on what Daniel said about having those conversations and being conversational, and then it's creating the opportunity for different types of conversation for different types of folk. So what we do is we have like an anonymous feedback portal where people can put in suggestions or make observations about the business from within the team, that then get just fed through as a commentary that we review each week on any comments that come through that portal. But we also provide opportunities for the staff and the team to sort of have mini conversations within different groups. So in actual fact, that's what's going on this morning. The trustees of the trust that own the shares, they host like small group meetings every 6 weeks to sort of discuss with the staff what's going on, with the team, to sort of say what concerns they might have about the business generally. But all those conversations go to sort of building up a level of trust where people are getting listened to. You've got to be listened to before you can get someone to, you've got to listen to someone before you can build that trust where they might actually reveal their true concerns, you know, not just a superficial concern about, oh, you know, the bathrooms aren't very clean or something like that, but actually something that has got real concern put for them. So it's building up that trust, and I think that is creating the opportunity for different conversations, and it takes several conversations sometimes before people actually sort of come to you with their inner authentic self, if you like. So it's about having different versions of that. We have big group town hall type meetings, but we'll have small group meetings, and then obviously the line managers within departments can also feed things back, and also the trustees are a source of go-to people If they didn't want to come to one of the directorate to ask about something, they can go through a trustee and go through that way. It's treated very confidentially.
Also, yeah, just to follow on from that conversation, is what I found quite interesting is the dialogue around policy versus real life. So for example, we put in mental health first aiders into organisations, and mental health first aid has got a little bit of a reputation because it's potentially been used badly. I'm a mental health first aid instructor. I'm a massive advocate for the work that they do. They're phenomenal. However, I have seen the function of mental health first aid being implemented in the wrong way, in terms of organisations saying, well, yeah, everyone's doing this mental health first aid thing, let's get some of our staff onto the mental health first aid, without taking into consideration who the staff member is. Do they have their own information? Have they got their own challenges? Are they the right person for the role? Because that level of trust, when we're talking about specifically around mental health, has to be built. And so what we are encouraging organisations to do is to take a holistic top-down, bottom-up approach that talks about highlighting and don't take for granted relationships and conversations that people are already building within your workforce. Because if you have a challenge, I'm sure all of us here, if we've got a challenge at work, there may be somebody at work that we are happy to talk to, not necessarily in a mental health first aid scenario, but just because we build up the narrative and trust with that person. But the person within the organisation needs to then understand how to signpost things effectively, or to take that to somebody more senior if they are concerned, and what that looks like. So when I say blanket approaches, for example, the Thriving at Work document, which talks around how to implement wellbeing in the organisation, the leftover from Theresa May, that talks about speaking to staff, understanding who you have on the ground, not putting people into positions just because the positions exist, and to also bring HR into your conversations, because people tend to have a little bit of a distrust with HR because they feel that HR belongs to the organisation, and therefore anything that goes to the organisation might be used against them later on. So there is a lot to think about when we're thinking about inclusion and wellbeing, because of a reputation that organisations and departments also may have. So think about your policies, think about your procedures, think about the right people in the right roles, and don't just fill roles in just because the policy states that you must have them. Do some work around what that person should be, and the kind of individual that people may or may not want to speak to originally.
Thank you. And on the mental health side of things, I think, have you got any suggestions, especially for the remote side of things? I mean, I've gone from a heavy office-based job to a full remote working job, and I've moved, and I think, how do you create that mental health working space for remote workers, especially in small teams? Have you got any ideas for that, Danielle?
Yeah, lots of ideas. Whether or not people will listen to them is a completely different matter. I mean, you're very limited when you have a fully remote team. We talk about the challenges that a fully remote team have, and absolutely they are. But what sort of things are put in place as a result of that? So, for example, on one organisation, it might be every Friday there is a Zoom drop-in. Whether or not that's mandatory or voluntary is a different matter. There is an individual organisation that does mandatory check-ins with everybody, because that's important, and that's one way that they can manage the mental health and well-being of their staff, just to give them some time. So there, somebody's talking about town hall without the subject matter, I guess, but just lots of space for people to drop in and out of when they wish. But being aware of the challenges and communicating what those challenges could be, again, is one of the first things to do, is just be upfront with the challenges that remote working has, and ask people. I'm all for asking people, not telling people what it is that they need, and also being aware that some people benefit way more from remote working than others. And that was something that came out around, lockdown, which was quite fascinating to me. People, and again, different people's frames of reference. Some people are saying, I absolutely loved it. Didn't need to leave my house. It's fantastic. Didn't need to see anybody. None of that small talk by the water fountain, etc., etc. It was great. Whereas other people were craving that connection and craving that, just chat by the water fountain. But they're very, very different individuals. So for me, it's about asking, and then grouping those people together, perhaps, that are like-minded and want the same things. That might be a start. So there's a lot of different things that you can do, but I'm a real firm believer in asking your team what they need. what they want and going with some of those ideas.
I think, yeah, that is a lesson from the pandemic, though, isn't it, where we all went remote. I think that checking in conversations are very important, and calling somebody up that works remotely. I mean, we've got staff based in China, and I call them literally not to talk about work, but just to sort of check in and see how they are, you know, sort of wish them happy birthday if they're going on holiday, find out about their holiday, talk about non-work things, you know, if you like, that sort of water cooler type conversations. And I purposely don't talk about work in that type of follow-up type conversation, but I do deliberately make the effort to make a social call on remote workers. We've got one or two that are remote, based in the UK as well, and in Ireland as well. But those conversations that are not necessarily just straight work conversations, because that's when people get Zoom fatigue, when it's just a constant one after the other meeting about work with no sort of social interaction in the workplace. I think that's a very unhealthy environment to create.
Can I just add to what Neil said and Danielle on hybrid working? There's a number of pieces of research that are going on, one in at Leeds University around hybrid working. And certainly when COVID came, you know, being a deliverer of training programs, you know, everything went online. And what you do miss is that connectivity. I would say, you know, without empirical research, you lose about 35% of that relationship. A lot of my clients would just say, well, you were delivering this, just put the PowerPoint onto the screen. It's not like that at all. People get bored. Some of you, you know, you might have seen the video on TikTok. We might be wearing shorts, pajamas. I don't know what you're doing. But the thing is to make it fun. So all the things that Danielle and Neil was saying is focus on people. Really get to that people thing. I know it's a British culture as well. Certainly when I was working at BMW, the German culture might be, what are you talking about? Why are you talking about the weekend? Let's get down to the, you know, there's a cultural aspect to this, but have catch-up meetings, as we've said, but work on a project together. This is what we would have been doing in the workplace. So not just that once in a week, but, you know, at the end of the day, in the middle of the day, and leaders then need to work out some real creative ways of actually getting things done, of actually just having a curry together or going out or doing something where there's an activity that somebody really needs to put their mind to. And the other thing that we really need to do is make sure that, you know, we do have a think about why we want people back in the workplace, and there is that relationship building. So I'm not convinced that we can do it remotely, and even large companies, global companies, will always have time where they try and bring people together just for a day or two. So work out what it is that we need to do with these meetings, and really work hard to get an activity that brings a smile on everybody's face. So those are the, I can see, can you just give me a smile and just help me this morning?
Yeah.
Thank you.
One of the, yeah, I mean, I just sort of say one of the things that, you know, if you've got 100% remote working team, which perhaps we probably all did, you know, this time last year, one of the things that we did that actually worked quite well was we had a run to China event, even though we're all working from home. What you did is you had to sort of do either, you could do a physical exercise that gained you miles that we then multiplied by 10. So if you ran 5 miles, you got 50 miles, and we put it into, we mixed up into departmental teams, and each team collected up their miles, and you could bake a cake, or, you know, that got you so many miles. So it was just an activity that was done in small groups, and then when you accumulated enough miles to sort of reach China, then we delivered a Chinese takeaway to those participants. And I suppose that was something that we did because we were all remote working. Now we're back in, we're doing 3, we're a hybrid team now, very much 3 days in, 2 days out, working from home. But if you're 100%, you could probably engage in those type of activities, like Cole's saying, you know, create an activity that brings the team together, but you can mix up the teams then if you're doing it as a social event. And it doesn't cost a lot. It just takes a little bit of time and thought and a bit of creativity to think, what can we do for a team that are maybe feeling a bit remote? I saw a thing pop up from Liz where you've got care workers that are 100% remote working. You know, that might bring together a little community of your care workers, not just to also share what their sort of mile accumulator is, but also to share what issues they've had that day. You know, if they drop in and have sort of a quick sort of Zoom catch up with the group, they can then share. You know, I know I keep sort of talking about sort of received wisdom from the old age, but you know, a problem shared is a problem halved, and there's a lot of truth in that adage. So you know, that's a way of building communities within your larger community by having smaller groups where they can share. It was just something. I mean, we also did cocktail making and chocolate making and all sorts of other crazy things as well online, as we all probably did.
Brilliant. We've got a question here, so I don't know if the panelists have seen about is there anything you can put in place to encourage people with disabilities or neurodivergent candidates to apply, and how have you made the interview process more accessible? Anyone got any?
Yeah, some of the things you can do, coming from a place perhaps of not being as informed as somebody else about what neurodivergence is, or you know, what do we mean, or maybe you don't feel confident about accessibility because you know, a lot of people, understandably, and I've been in this place as well, where you fear of like making a mistake by your effort that ends up being worse than not trying. Like, what if I do something that I think is going to be really helpful and accessible, and actually I get torn down on Twitter for it, or it doesn't achieve what I want it to achieve? There's a sort of a fear of failure around it, but also a fear of being embarrassed by making the effort if you kind of don't necessarily feel like you know what you're doing. And I don't know if anyone else identifies with that, but you don't need to be an expert to do this and to make things more accessible. Although I would argue that information and training, so allyship's been mentioned in the chat, and you know, mental health first aid, whilst it's not intended, I know Danielle, as a kind of a way to make a process as more accessible, but people doing programs, you know, like mental health first aid, where it's more of like an awareness of an issue and how to like respond without being an expert, but to give you the confidence to do things. And there's lots of stuff out there to do that. It can be quite scary. And in terms of kind of resources, you know, businesses like ours don't have millions of pounds to invest in those resources. So what do? You've got a good intention, but maybe you don't want to get it wrong. And I think there's some things you can do that are for free, that you can experiment with, that may feel counterintuitive, but might get you a really good result. And something that I've experimented with recently. So as well as my day job, I'm on the board at TAF Housing, which is a social housing business in Cardiff that homes 1,600 families. And we wanted to increase the diversity of our workforce, not only because that's a good thing, because it would make us more innovative and it would make us, you know, more reflective of the community, but also because it's the right thing to do for our customers. You know, we want them to see people working in the business that are like them. So we've started doing things like sharing half or all of the interview questions in advance of an interview, because not everyone performs on the day. And that could be confidence. It could be people that are just better at, you know, telling you a story versus those that are actually more reliable, maybe. I don't know. We've been in that situation, I'm sure. And it feels weird, like, hang on a minute, the interview's a test. You should be able to rise to the challenge to win the job. Well, yeah, it sort of is a test. It's a test of the person's likely ability to do the job role. Surely in a business situation, you would, if you wanted someone to present to you or to show you how good they were at something, you'd allow them to prepare. Otherwise, it'd be really unfair. So why don't we do it with interviews? We've tried experimenting with that at TAF Housing, and it's working really well for us. Colleagues that are, you know, less confident, whether it be because they've got a physical or mental, maybe it might be a disability, or it might just be a condition that kind of falls into that description that Cool was talking about earlier, where, you know, it's not something that they want to kind of maybe declare, but it's something that they might need some support with. Or Danielle was talking about, you kind of caught my attention earlier, Danielle, were like, you know, will I be supported with this? Well, you know, this is a way of demonstrating support without doing a questionnaire, without collecting any data, and without even having been in the company yet. I can see that I'm going to be supported, and it builds that trust. And there's things you can do like that, you know, sharing the the joining instructions for a course in advance, but actually then calling and making sure someone's seen them and read them. Because some people, as a result of their preference or even their neurodiversity, may not think to even read that stuff, but it's really important that they know. And just those little extra pieces of care that we can do for people ahead of an interview, ahead of a course, ahead of a meeting, shows that we care and will get us a better result in terms of inclusion, which is what we're talking about. And my take on that is that we should celebrate those differences rather than kind of, you know, sort of shrugging our shoulders and trying to work it out. But I know that it's a challenging thing to do, especially if you feel like you don't know what you're doing. And so, again, in my experience, having made some mistakes in this area as well, if you explain your intent, I think people are much more likely to help you change what you're doing so it works for them better next time than if you don't share your intent and people feel like they're being done to. And it comes back to that point of listening and asking people what they want.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow on from that, everything Andrew just said. Absolutely everything. Again, it takes away the standard processes and protocols and the way we always do things, and then show that every individual that comes into our organisations, we take on face value and speak to them to find out what it is that they need. And I think that actually there is nothing better than going through that process to demonstrate and prove your inclusivity in terms of your recruitment processes. And I was also thinking while Andrew was talking, you know, I don't know if you remember, you know, lots of organisations having personality profiling and how petrifying that would be for people. I've not done one of those for many years, but I think I used it more as a way to find out if me and my husband were, you know, compatible or whatever it may or may not be, as more of a little bit of a funny side, versus actually going into an organisation. And I understand that obviously organisations are very different and prefer or need to work with certain types of people, but even that doesn't feel inclusive to me. You know, we need certain people sitting in certain roles because of certain personality traits. So from that point of view, yeah, definitely try and do the inclusivity part before they even join, as a way to prove and demonstrate your commitment to that.
Brilliant, thank you. Great question. Anyone else wanted to follow up on that? Or
I mean, what I would say is that personality profiling doesn't necessarily have to be to sort of match the job. You know, I don't think that would be a nonsense to sort of say, oh, it takes this certain personality to do this particular type of job. But what it can do is it can help line managers understand that person, maybe sort of at least sort of from a checkbox, and sort of say, well, actually, this person's very introverted. I best not be starting to ask them about their holiday in front of, like, you know, at the start of a team meeting or something like that, because I'm just going to embarrass them. So it can be useful in the right sort of context, I think.
Can I just add a bit of colour to that? Sorry to listen to me again, sorry, but there's a difference between aptitude testing and simulating a job role as part of a selection process versus like the personality profiles that can tell you somebody's preferences as opposed to their competencies and behaviours.
Sure.
And I'm sorry, I'm only making this point because I use psychometric testing in my day job. Cool, I'm sure you probably have similar stuff around leadership that you use and you rely on. Some metrics are better than others. You know, not all tests are created equally statistically valid. And even then, you're talking a lot of the time about self-perception rather than someone's perception from others. And sort of somewhere in all of that mix is kind of truth. And we often perceive ourselves differently than we come across or than we are for lots of reasons, but including things like confidence, having done them before, fear of doing the wrong thing on the test. And so if anyone here thinks they would like to use some sort of testing process as part of their recruitment, or even their internal kind of, you know, measuring of performance processes, that's okay to do that. But choose the device and the metric really, really cautiously. And I would say 100% find someone who's an expert in using that. Ethical providers of those services will not sell you a personality profile as a recruitment tool. They may offer you a tool that you can use in recruitment that enables you to open up the conversation. So Neil, like you were just saying about how do I open up the conversation with someone in a work setting, it might give the manager some intelligence about where to start, but without boxing that person in. You know, you ask the person how that, you know, what they want as opposed
I think that's exactly it. It gives you maybe like a conversation starter. It's not like, oh, this is black and white. We do use at recruitment, we use a motivation factors questionnaire as to what people are motivated by, and that just allows us then to explore that question. We can question what comes out at the top of their list. Is it really a corner office that you're looking for, or are you completely money centric, or actually are you interested in your personal development and training? So the different factors that come through, it just allows us to create a conversation around that, to sort of say, right, okay, this is going to be someone that can fit into our organization, or into that particular role.
If I could jump in here, I think we're going down the rabbit hole. Which selection stage is going to give us the best candidate?
Sure.
Yeah, whoops. Sorry about that.
No. Of course we want the best candidate, but isn't it amazing? Every organisation I've been to, there are two factors that absolutely knock our fallacy that everything is fair. One is the culture, and the other is implicit bias in those panels. We all have implicit bias, and Andrew's absolutely right. I used to run, I've done so many psychometric tests. We did some last week. You give one to one person one day, the outcome is different because of what's happened in their life. You give them next week, it's slightly different, and its life is like that. It's unclear, it's unclean. But one thing I do know is for small businesses, you want to try and just outsource. We did this with Greater Manchester Police in raising, uplifting levels of women at senior position. And what I said to the Chief Constable is, one thing you can take out is bias and culture of the organisation. And we outsourced the recruitment to a company that didn't know those candidates. And in the first year, we uplifted 25% women into senior positions. Now that's telling us something about the culture, how people are viewing different candidates. So I know we're talking about small businesses, but if you can get some help and perhaps work collaboratively, I work with local businesses, if we can share our resources sometimes and actually just outsource, have a great outline of what you want people to do, but just try and extricate yourself from the implicit biases that we do have. And we know from research, you all got your jobs within 20 to 40 seconds of walking through that door or being online. That's what research is telling us. And then we spend the next hour in confirmation mode, confirming our decision to give you that job. That's how it works. So if we can try and give that to an external objective point of view, you might get some more. And the last thing I wanted to say is that from my reading of where organizations have gone, we have slavishly for recruitment, we've gone down the competency road of what competencies we need for this role. What we haven't done is what are the values. So when you look at the profession that I belonged to, which is policing, that's what they did. They got people in with competencies, tick, you're going to be a good cop. But I tell you what, the values were wrong for the organisation. And now it's flipped over in policing, where values are really tested. What will you do with this person? How will you be empathetic? What would you do with diversity? So I think we just need to have a little bit of a balance between competencies and values as well. But and that was it, really.
Thank you.
I've got a quick question, Hunter. How would you assess somebody's values? How do you go about doing that?
If I could jump back, Sam, some of the specialist work that we did, if anybody can remember Boris Johnson, his news of the day today, Boris Johnson's extra 20,000 cops, we were the specialist consultancy brought in to help with that. Yes, they got the numbers in policing terms. What they didn't get is the once in a lifetime to change the diverse nature of policing, and yet it's still a success. Unfortunately, that's where we are. So it's easy to get the numbers, it's harder to get the diversity in. But what we did, we sort of looked at some of the profiles, and when we were looking at values, we were looking at real case studies out in the workplace. So, for instance, if somebody came to you for help, how could you measure how people are empathetic? And a lot of the questions were rooted to the competency value framework. This is the framework that the police use for competencies and values. And what we did was we split out the values and said, okay, you know, Neil talks about wisdom. I talk about real sort of like outcomes that you can see that are tangible. So what is it that a good outcome would be between two people in a shopping centre? And you don't have to like build it up to great crisis. You just have a simple interaction of I've been assaulted, I've had a theft, and then you can then put in some outcomes of that value. The outcomes would be that I listen to you, and the outcome might be that, Sam, if you'd been in an incident, instead of saying how much was taken, I first go to your psychological safety and say, how are you? Are you hurt? Do you need? So we would then say, okay, the better candidates would look after people's psychological safety and physical safety, and then ask the questions later. So you can engineer questions around values. And I totally reject people saying you can't. You can, but you just need to put a little bit more thought into it.
Yeah, we actually do that, Cool. We actually at recruitment stage, we do a motivation factors, but also do a values questionnaire as well. And again, it's not to sort of say those are the values that they necessarily hold. They might be putting that down because they think that's what you want to hear, but it gives us an opportunity to question them around that in the interview. So we actually have a bit of a break. We have we sort of have quite a sort of lengthy interview process, but we interview them, they do the questionnaire, and then we come back and we share the result of that questionnaire with them. And then we sort of say, could you give us an example of where you might have expressed that value? Or why would you choose that value? That type of question to sort of see, is it just something that they're putting down because they think it looks good?
Yeah. I'm sorry, Neil, I just wanted to add in, the example you've given is a backward facing question. Give us an example. What we've got to do is get them to look forward into
or how would you put that into practice? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of got around recruitment this, whereas I sort of think the thing was more about sort of like, how do you've got your team in place, how do you make it feel more inclusive? I think we probably need to sort of look at that as well a little bit. And
yeah, it is
to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's about building communication and listening within your team, and I think building honesty and trust. And this is all comes around building the right sort of culture. I think I spoke with Neil before, didn't we, yesterday? And about being proactive, especially for the small businesses, is they can be proactive, whereas for larger businesses it tends to be a lot of reactive, and it's harder for a larger business to change their culture that's been embedded for a long time, whereas a small business now, you can create this culture where you are honest, where you create trust, where you communicate and listen, be safe and supportive now for in the future when you are growing. And this is why I think we might have digressed quite a bit into recruitment, is being proactive for the future for these small businesses, of being able to hire a team and creating this culture in the first place. I mean, that's what I feel like I've got from the conversation we've had today.
I think it's about talking about your own values as well as a business. I mean, I speak, very regularly. I will use our values of caring, cooperation, and encouragement in just the conversation at work. So people talk in that way, and I sort of say, is that the caring thing to do? Is that the cooperating thing to do? Is that the encouraging thing to do? And don't get me wrong, I can be as hard-arsed when it comes to accountability, responsibility, and measurement. and all that sort of business school stuff. But in actual fact, the stuff that really wins out and makes average people perform brilliantly is caring, cooperation, and encouragement. And a team of average people can outperform a team of brilliant individuals by working as a team. I'm absolutely confident in that. I see myself as being an average type of guy. Yeah, and you know, there are exceptional people out there, but exceptional talent doesn't always win the race. You know, if you work together, it's a team effort. Business is very much a team effort, and it's about including people and taking everyone on the journey, I think. Just to put that in there.
I also think it's important that, you know, I'm so glad you said that, Neil, because we're talking about values of the individuals that work for our organisations, but what about the organisational value, right? And there is a lot of organisations that talk about vision, mission, you know, environment, culture, and yet when you actually get into the environment and the culture, it doesn't speak to the values that they talk about, or the mission or the vision that the shareholders or the people at the top envisage that their organisation has, when you're talking to everyday employees that do not feel like that. So there is sometimes a disconnect between those people on the ground and what the senior leadership team are saying as part of that. And I understand there are multiple layers in between, especially in bigger organisations where people haven't quite got a hold on that culture, for example. So organisational values, especially with the new workforce coming up, they are more interested or feel that they wish to work for organisations that walk the walk and talk the talk, as opposed to going into organisations and seeing, you know, seeing what it's like, I guess. So yeah, totally to echo that, the organisation. And I love your approach about talking about your you know, is that communicative, is that, you know, part of the caring culture? To reiterate it all the time is a really powerful thing, because it keeps people accountable. So although we all have mission, vision, etc., it's about walking the walk and talking the talk. I'm really kind of encouraged to hear that.
I like what Neil said earlier about the approach you took to, you know, connecting people during lockdown and since, because I kind of, you know, a bit like earlier, there's a lot of love in the room today. I kind of agree with everything that's being said, because it not only makes sense, but it's kind of, you know, ethically, morally the right thing to do. It's like a kind of human behavior. It's not just check sheets and tick boxes because we, you know, we have to, it's because we want to. And I wonder if some of this kind of boils down to just kind of intention and like just thoughtfulness. Like, you're not always going to get it right, but intentionally being thoughtful about what we're doing, how we're behaving, and how we involve people, and how we make an inclusive place to work. So, you know, there was a range of activities that Neil discussed earlier, and it's great because lots of people can get involved. If your weekly social is Friday lunchtime down the pub, that's going to exclude anyone that isn't really interested in alcohol or going to pubs. So the next week you do something different. You go to a coffee shop, and then the week after, you know, there's a summer event. So what we'll do is we'll do a picnic in the park rather than just going and getting drunk on a Friday night. And I think alcohol's not the only thing, but I think it's one place where businesses kind of gravitate. It's easy, isn't it, to organise this, or not really, because people may not attend, but it's easy to organise a social event and you know, get people together so that they bond and feel like part of the team, or even kind of work stuff, you know, kind of the forced fun stuff. Like, don't do the forced fun stuff. Ask people what you can do to give people an away day or time together, or, you know, the really awkward icebreaker at the start of a course that nobody wants to do. Like, don't do that. Like, just kind of think about what you want to do, and what, because you're not in a massive organization where things are dictated to you and you've kind of got to crack on. You're in the really unique position of moving quickly and forging your own path. And I think, you know, to Danielle's point, the next generation of workers that are coming through, and for the first time ever, we've got 5 generations of workers in the same workforce. The next generation coming through care deeply about purpose and inclusion and doing the right thing, more so than any other generation before. More than salary in some cases, and more than prestige and just getting a nice shiny car. So that thoughtful intention at every stage of every process in your business, in every conversation, in every interaction, all of that stuff really is culture, isn't it? When we say culture, it's like, how do I feel when I'm at work, and what do people say about it when I'm not here? And you're not always going to get it right. I just kind of think, like, just accept as well that you're going to make a mistake, and if you do, fess up straight away, because that is culture as well. Like, it's okay not to be an expert in all of these areas, but to do things with the right intention will differentiate you from, the people that are offering employment in your local area, and you can have the competitive advantage of getting the best people.
Brilliant. Benjamin, have you got something to add?
Yeah, and it's interesting on that the culture thing there. It's like there's two bits. I think one to Danielle's thing, I think it's being really aware of your expressed culture versus experienced culture, because that can be really dangerous, where an organization says this is our culture, interviews people on that basis, and that's not what they are, because they haven't done the groundwork of, in our world, we kind of survey the staff and kind of map out what the culture is. Is it consistent? Is it different in different places? Where some organizations go, this is our culture, tell a bunch of people that they do that. In fact, we had one business we picked up recently who'd done that last year, and they lost 80% of their graduate intake because they basically told them the organization was not what it was. And so all those people joined, and you can imagine they were deeply unhappy, and the fallout in the organization was huge. So I think with all of this, it's actually being really real about where you're at with all of these things. Because again, for a lot of organizations, I think they're like, oh, we're becoming this inclusive workplace. You have to start from, actually, we haven't done things right in the past, and here are mistakes that we've made, and here are some things that we believe are still problems. Tell us about that, as opposed to, hey, we're great and we're amazing, because people see, I think, Neil, you made the comment, people see what it's like on the ground, and if there's a disconnect there, you're never going to build the trust to move things along. So it is so important to kind of understand where you're at and go from there. I think my last one, just on that hiring thing, and for us, for hiring people, it's been an interesting journey, and our thing now is making sure that we don't have a process that would stop us hiring the best candidate in the world. And most organizations are like, well, we think we've got a process to hire the best candidate, but one of our customers used an example of, like, if I had Leonardo da Vinci and I can't remember who else, they kind of listed off all these people with these different talents, and then said, and my assessment is going to be how fast you can run a 100-meter sprint. Then you'd hire the I can't remember what the example was, but you would kind of turn away Leonardo da Vinci and Steve Jobs and all these other people. So really going, what does the role require, and looking only at those things, and creating mechanisms to diffuse the other bits, and letting people experience the culture. I think it's another learning thing for us, about have them meet multiple people in the organization as part of that recruitment process. So rather than you going, these are our values, they can see people in action, can experience it and decide for themselves, as opposed to you going, oh, we're really great at X, Y, Z. It's much more compelling if they can meet the people. But really interesting discussion, interesting points around culture and its role in all of this as well.
Can I just add, we when I go into organisations, we always talk about culture, and everybody has a different definition of culture. One of my favourites is, the way we do things around here, Deal and Kennedy, 1982, but then you've got loads of others. But, culture is just like multi-layered, and a lot of people will talk about culture and externalise it. We are the culture. You're the culture of your company. But when we're doing things, you're actually excluding that culture. And one of the things that we need to do is know what the effects of culture is. So when you look at culture, culture is looking almost like organically to stay the same. So it stays the same. The minute somebody says, I don't want to be part of this culture, it becomes a problem. The minute somebody will say, I don't like that language, or I don't like the way things are done, you're a problem. So you become that problem. So the first thing I'd say to people is, try and think about your culture and say, what's good about it? After this session, just write it on a bit of paper. What's good about my culture? What's not so good? And that gives you a header as to what you're doing with people. Secondly, a lot of our conversations that we have, even today, fall into two categories. And having coming from a criminal justice background of policing, I often thought in policing, we often had opinion-based conversations in a legally based organisation. So it's about my opinion. Institutional racism exists. No, it doesn't. Sexism exists. No, it doesn't. And that's why I spent 6 years looking at institutional racism. It does exist. And what I was trying to prove there to myself and others is that we've got to move the conversation to an evidence-based conversation. We have far too many opinion-based conversations. Again, I'm thinking of Boris this morning. I don't know why, it's just been on the radio. And there's loads of opinions about, you know, migrants coming in boats. Is that going down? Is that going up? So one thing I'd get all of you to just think about is culture. And then why are you doing this? They're really warm words. You know, we need to make people feel happy, well-being and whatever. Do you know the first thing we need to start off with is having an honest conversation with ourselves and saying, what does it bring? When you look at global companies now, they know that inclusive thinking actually uplifts their performance by 25%. Now, I know that's only one research by Deloitte, but it gives an inkling. And if you want to read anything about why, rooting it into the why, Matthew Said, Rebel Ideas, chapter 1, that's all you need to read. Because what you're doing is you're centering why your organization needs to be diverse. And you need to link it into operational imperatives, operational objectives. So let me give you a good example with the police. When we're doing the police uplift.
Oh, we are running out of time.
Yeah, I'm going to be very quick. So the police has very little capability of Black and Asian surveillance operatives. So it has no capability. That is an organizational imperative. So for each of your companies, why do you want inclusion and why do you want diversity? If you answer the question why, the what will then fold up. I'm done, Hunter. I could go
Brilliant.
on.
That is a great way to actually end as well. I think taking from this is, you know, ask yourself why, write down those points about culture, you know, what is good, what is bad, and how does your culture align with your values, and do they align? I think that's a lot from what we should take from today. And you know, from what I said earlier, you know, honesty, trust, communication, creating a safe and supportive workplace where people communicate at all levels, I think is, you know, really what it's all about, isn't it, from today? So I just want to say thank you to everyone